Hi, I'm Dr. Sambhaji Shinde. I'm an assistant professor of English. Today we are going to discuss about romantic literary critic whose name is Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Especially we are going to discuss about his critical work which is written in 1817. Uh, its name is Biographia Literaria. S.T. Coleridge was a Romantic critic, and among his critical works, the two works are very famous. Among these, Biographia Literaria is his very famous critical work. Another one is Lectures on Shakespeare and Other Poets. Coleridge had formative influences upon him. Wordsworth, the famous Romantic poet, had enormous influence upon him. Others are Hartley, and Hartley's associationist psychology influenced S.T. Coleridge a lot. S.T. Coleridge also under the heavy influence of German philosophy, especially a Kantian view of imagination. He considers his view as imagination as a simplistic power. It is art which is it is considered as a recreation. It is the soul of artist fuses with the external reality and transforms and recreates it. His lectures on Shakespeare was indeed a worthwhile critical work. He actually his work is published posthumously. It is a fine example of practical criticism. He applied impressionistic approach to Shakespeare. He discussed and revolts against the Augustan conception of poetry. He considered Shakespeare as an ancestor to modern. He is considered as an ancestor to modern Shakespearean critic. His most popular critical work is Biographia Literaria, which is published in 1817. The first intended title of this Biographia Literaria was Autobiographia Literaria. It has two parts, and first part contains 16 chapters of philosophizing. Last seven chapters discuss about the poetic theory of Wordsworth, which gives an remarkable demonstration of Coleridge's critical powers. Last three chapters discusses enduring description of the Romantic poetry. The poet's theory of imagination links two parts. According to him, imagination has two types, and it is his unique contribution to literary theory. He divides imagination into two parts. First is a primary imagination, and second is a secondary imagination. According to him, primary imagination is a power of receiving impressions of the external world through the senses. It is an involuntary act of the mind and it is universal. While secondary imagination is the peculiar and distinctive attribute of the artist that makes artistic creation possible. It works upon primary imagination. It is simplistic, or he called it as creative power. He also talks about fancy, and fancy is not a creative power. It deals with fixities and definities and only combines what it perceives. While imagination is the very soul, fancy is the drapery of poetic genius. His theory of poetry proposes pleasure should be the end of poetry. Pleasure arises from the organic unity of the work of art. He defines a legitimate poem is a composition in which the rhyme and meter bear an organic relation to the total work. He explores the neoclassical view of poetry as imitation and It shows that it is an activity of imagination which in turn is a shaping power and unifying power, the power which dissolves, dissipates, and creates. His theory of poetry, in his theory of poetry, prose and poetry differs in their very nature. They, the prose and poetry are two different types. He distinguishes a poem from poetry also. According to him, poetry is an activity of poet's mind, while poem is one of the forms of expression, a verbal expression of the activity of the poet's mind. Here is a comparison of Coleridge's and Wordsworth's poetic views. Wordsworth was interested in the practice of poetry and considered only the impact of imagination on poetry, whereas Coleridge was interested in the theory of imagination, and he was also interested in the nature of imagination, and he examined its role in creative activity. Wordsworth used fancy and imagination as synonymous, while Coleridge distinguished between fancy and imagination. Wordsworth didn't distinguish primary and secondary imagination, but Coleridge made distinction between primary and secondary imagination. Now, Coleridge's criticism of Wordsworth's preface to Lyrical Ballad. Theme of poetry, choice of rustic themes by Wordsworth. Here, Coleridge comments over the Wordsworth's theory of poetry. He criticizes Wordsworth in the view that Wordsworth's characters are not chosen from rustic life. He gives an example of Michael, which is an exception to Wordsworth's theory of poetry. He talks about language and sentiments do not necessarily arise from their abode or occupation. A man will not be benefited from a life in rural solitudes unless he has a natural sensibility and suitable education. Here he differs from Wordsworthian theory of poetry. Coleridge agrees with Aristotle's view that characters of poetry must be universal and typical. Wordsworth's characters are representative in this sense. He talks about a rustic language which is advocated by William Wordsworth. He says that communication with an object implies reflection on it and its richness and the richness of vocabulary arises from such reflection. Best part of man's language does not result merely from communication with nature, but from education, from the mind's dwelling on noble thoughts and ideals of masterminds of humanity. Here, his views are diametrically opposite to his friend's William Wordsworth's views. About poetic diction, he has also his own views. According to Wordsworth, the selection of real language of man should be the diction of poetry. But here he opposed Wordsworth's theory that there is no essential difference between the language of prose and poetry. Every man's language varies according to the extent of his knowledge, the activity of his faculties, and the depth or quickness of his feelings. No two men speak the same language, says S.T. Coleridge. In prose and poetry, the arrangement of language is different. Poetry is the best words in the best order. Poetry uses meter. Wordsworth, where S.T. Coleridge proposes the view. He also talks about the willing suspension of disbelief, the willingness of a reader or a viewer to accept the premises of a work of fiction, even if they are fantastic or impossible, the willingness of the audience to overlook the limitations of a medium so that these do not interfere with the illusion, and it constitutes poetic faith. His criticism is a practical criticism. He is also called as the father of impressionistic criticism. He is considered as a romantic critic a new kind of criticism which dealt with a knockout blow to neoclassical criticism. He evaluated William Shakespeare and other English dramatists. He also evaluated John Milton, and William Wordsworth. His practical criticism is always illuminating and highly original. It does not judge on the basis of any rules like the neoclassical critics. Thank you.